9/11 brought some profound challenges to our country, our government, and our military. And our efforts to deal with those challenges have raised some difficult legal issues and led to some unprecedented and problematical changes in the way we treat combatants captured on the battlefield of the war on terror. Welcome to ThinkTech on OC16, Hawaii's weekly newscast on things that matter to tech and to Hawaii. I'm Jay Fidell.
And I'm Duke Oshi.
In our show tonight, we'll cover what's going on in the prison at Guantanamo, Cuba, and what legal issues have been raised and resolved about the status of the detainees there.
The Bush administration created the prison at Guantanamo and what they called military commissions as a way to deal with combatants from the battlefield in Afghanistan almost 10 years ago. These things have been the subject of controversy ever since.
We're lucky to have three experts on the subject. My brother Gene Fidell teaches military justice at Yale Law School, and in fact, he teaches a course about Guantanamo with my sister-in-law, Linda Greenhouse, formerly of the New York Times. Gene will be the moderator of our panel today.
Joining Gene is Avi Soifer, Dean of the William S. Richardson School of Law at UH Manoa and a Yale constitutional law scholar. We'll also have Ed Burke, who's been practicing law in Honolulu for more than 40 years and has been representing a client incarcerated in Guantanamo.
We'll hear this distinguished panel discuss the background of Guantanamo as a prison for these detainees and the actions of the government in the determination of their legal rights.
Today's subject is Guantanamo. We're going to have a conversation lasting about an hour, try to pick up the story as it stands at the end of 2010. I'm Gene Fidell. I teach at Yale Law School. I'm head of the National Institute of Military Justice. With me are Ed Burke and Avi Soifer. Gentlemen, would you introduce yourselves, please?
Well, I'm Ed Burke. I've been representing a Guantanamo prisoner for the last 5.5 years. And I must say he's still locked away. I've been practicing law in this state for, 44 years now.
And I'm Avi Soifer. I'm the Dean of the Law School in Hawaii, known as the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii. And we've had Ed Burke come speak because we greatly admire someone who's willing to do that kind of work for the public good.
Oh, thank you.
Great. I should add, by the way, I've been involved in many of the Guantanamo issues, but I don't represent anyone there, and to some extent that's intentional because I would like to be able to at least claim that I don't have a horse in the race aside from the institutional one. So, Avi, that leaves you.
I teach constitutional law, so I don't know anything about these matters. The military justice issues are really quite separate, and you teach a course in that, and you know that stuff. You're practicing that stuff, so I'm here just to be a pretty face.
Right, and that's what everybody says about you, Avi. Anyway, let's begin. One of the problems that I think we're facing as this year wraps up is the danger of what I'll call Guantanamo fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
You think that's set in? What do you think, Avi?
I think that's right. I think it's also hard to keep track of the cases that have already come down and that people are not paying attention to the newer cases. Some of that has to do with the change in administration. And one of the things we might talk about is how much the new administration really has changed the law or the approach at Guantanamo and about state secrets and other such matters. But I think it's a long way away from 9/11 now, and some of the fervor after 9/11 certainly has dissipated. Some of that, ironically, means that we're not taking care of the people who were the first responders in Congress. But we're also sort of saying, well, didn't something happen with Guantanamo? Isn't that something that's over with now? Clearly it isn't over with now, and that's what I hope you two will talk about.
It is interesting. My wife and I co-teach a class on Guantanamo. This coming semester it'll be about Guantanamo and Bagram. And our students are all at least in their mid-20s, let's say. And for many of them, the post-9/11 era, what I'll call the Guantanamo era, is all they've ever known. as adults. So we find that we have to sort of catch ourselves and say, well, you understand what the backdrop is against which this particular story has played out. Ed, how about you? You're at this 5.5 years. You don't look like you're suffering from Guantanamo fatigue, are you?
No, but I must say my perception of this is up to the very beginning of this administration. I think people had a great deal of sympathy for the prisoners in Guantanamo. It was considered that many of them were being treated unjustly and deserved to be freed, released at the first opportunity. And I must say we all had great hope when President Obama took office and made his announcement that Guantanamo would be closed within a year. Closing meant releasing the prisoners to us, not transferring them off to some other prison. I think that with the passage of time and certain actions by Congress, which have been part of appropriations bills and have basically stated that none of the Guantanamo people can be sent to the United States except perhaps for a trial, but not being confined and certainly not to be freed within the United States as the Uyghurs almost were.
Just for clarification for viewers, the Uyghurs are Chinese Muslims who were captured in Afghanistan, but they're not unfriendly to the United States. They're considered a problem by the Chinese government, which presumably would take very strong measures, let's say, against them if they were ever repatriated.
Well, as a bottom line, my perception now is that people in Congress and maybe the majority of people in the United States look upon the remaining prisoners down in Guantanamo as enemies.
So Cheney,
terrorists.
Cheney won.
I think Cheney has won so far.
Mm-hmm.
The worst of the worst, I think, is now the perception, and not a whole lot of interest in this country in freeing any of them.
And indeed, former President Bush the Younger has just come out with an autobiography in which he, when asked about the steps that were taken, including torture for detainees, said, "Damn right." That was his take on it. So he is completely unrepentant. On the status of your client, he is still at Guantanamo?
Yes, we had our habeas corpus hearing, which is the main thing that all of the lawyers in my category are referred to as the habeas bar. And but we had our hearing, 2 days of trial in the Washington, D.C. Federal District Court last April. And unfortunately, the decision was against us.
Which judge did you have?
Judge Robertson,
Mm-hmm.
who, at just
you
a
drew
matter,
a good judge.
I think so. Just a matter of weeks before our hearing, there had been another hearing, I think, in the Salahi case, in which he had freed the prisoner, basically reasoning that although this man had been a member of Al Qaeda, many years before, he had divorced himself from that membership and therefore should be freed. The D.C. Appellate Court, however, ruled fairly recently, in the last couple of months, that that was an erroneous decision, and so Mr. Salahi is still with us.
Now, is his case before the District of Columbia Circuit, or is it over at this point? What's the procedural posture of your client's case?
Well, we're on appeal,
Right.
and I think our brief is due in a very few weeks now. And I must say that based upon many of the recent D.C. Circuit decisions, we have a very uphill fight.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The pendulum does seem to have swung against the contentions of the detainees in general in that circuit.
I think so,
Yeah.
yes. But of course, they are the ones that the D.C. Circuit Court was reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court on about 4 or 5 different occasions. So we all have hope that ultimately justice will prevail.
Mm-hmm. Avi, you're a constitutional scholar.
I said I teach constitutional law.
Always answer a question with a question. But can you situate you know, the kinds of issues that we're dealing with right now and the state of play, this is an unfolding legal saga.
Right.
Can you situate this saga against some of the other great episodes in the country's constitutional history? Is this a major deal in terms of the constitutional history, a major constitutional moment, or is it a relatively small fry?
Oh, I think it's a major moment, but it's a moment that has lasted a long time, so maybe moment isn't quite the right word for it. So to go back to 9/11, there was considerable patriotism and support for the United States around the world right after that. The Patriot Act, I think, had some clearly constitutionally dubious provisions, but it was very hard for a politician at that point to vote against what seemed to be necessary for national security and support for the government. One of the crucial things I think that is often overlooked is that a lot of this is a debate between Congress and the courts, but Congress's side of the debate is often pretty murky. Congress may sometimes lack some spine. And so one of the curious things about the Supreme Court decision of Boumediene, or however you pronounce it, in 2008, was that Congress seemed to say something in response to the court. So it's a dialogue between the two. But when it turned out that some of the key senators, like Senator Specter, said, well, we voted for it, but we hadn't read it, we didn't understand it, that didn't help Congress's side of the negotiation between the two. And the Supreme Court, to the surprise of many, said even though Congress seems to have permitted this, it's a constitutional problem. So the courts are often the last resort. And if we go back to the War Power, for example, the War Powers resolution passed after both the Nixon experience and Vietnam and Cambodia gave Congress lots of procedural roles to play. But Congress has never had the courage to actually use its procedures. So Congress seems to be very happy to say, when it comes to national security, we will authorize the spending, but we'll blame somebody else in case it goes wrong. The same thing could be said about habeas corpus. The Congress seemed pretty willing to give up on its authority, and it was only for the courts to step in and say, wait a minute, you do have the power to suspend the Great Writ, but you really have to do it. You can't do it in this half-baked way. And so Justice Kennedy's opinion was, I think, a very important opinion about the importance of habeas corpus. Now, having said that, some of the heroes of this story are Navy JAG officers who stood up and knew that their careers were at stake. And in fact, what turned out was they were right to suspect that their careers would be over within the Navy, but they stood up and did what we like to think lawyers should do. And that is to say, I've got a client, there has to be some procedure here. It has to be fair. It can't just be saying, we name you something and that sticks.
It's very interesting. There is a theme that has emerged over the last now 10 years involving the professional responsibility of lawyers within the military services. Just to give some illustrations. There were the uniformed lawyers who pushed back under the second President Bush against the use of torture, the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, that's French for torture. And those people resisted internally and relatively discreetly, let's say, the efforts by Vice President Cheney, his advisor David Addington, the General Counsel at the Pentagon, a man named Jim Haynes, to permit and authorize the use of interrogation techniques that violate the Convention Against Torture. So you have that bit of pushback, which, by the way, had a very interesting bit of fallout. The pushback there was by senior judge advocates, the judge advocates general, and the result was that Congress, feeling this was a good thing, elevated the position of judge advocate general to a 3-star position. So the incumbents are now lieutenants general and vice admirals rather than majors general and rear admiral. So that's been an interesting sort of subplot. Another group of lawyers is the uniformed lawyers who represented people at the military commissions held at Guantanamo. Now the history there is they had a tradition to build on, namely during World War II, there was a famous incident involving some German saboteurs who were put ashore from a submarine. They were represented by Army officers and those officers pulled out all the stops. They did a very energetic job, and actually history was very kind to them, despite the fact that they were representing some extremely unpopular clients. Ditto for the current generation of military defense counsel. Many of them have taken hits professionally in one way or another, whether it's directly related to their performance as defense counsel is an issue in some cases, because promotions are never automatic in the military. But those people did step up to the plate and provided very rigorous service in an environment that itself raises important professional responsibility issues. I mean, do you actually defend somebody, or do you say, I'm out of here because this is an unfair situation? And we can have some conversation about that too, because I think some of the professional responsibility issues here that are very troublesome from a lawyer's perspective. Then there's a third subset. They are the prosecutors in the military commissions. And what you find is that one after another of the chief prosecutors quit because they felt that command influence, or unlawful command influence, was being exerted over their performance as chief prosecutors. One is Colonel Mo Davis, has been very much in the news and is a very vocal now adversary of the military commissions. At the time, he was a cheerleader and a friend of the military commissions. So the history from a lawyering perspective is quite interesting and encouraging. And that's without even getting to people like Ed. Now, Ed, you had a lot of company. I mean, you're a distinguished practitioner here in the Honolulu bar, and you've had company from some of the bluest chip, whitest shoe firms in the country. What's it like?
Well, it's a very challenging thing to do, really, and I must say it gets to be frustrating. One point I think that it's important for the audience to realize is that the military commissions was something that was enacted during the Bush administration, was ultimately held to be unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's a type of jurisprudence that barely got off the ground. The military officers were involved in the main in what they call the high-value detainees, and that group.
Meaning whom? Just so viewers will understand.
Like Sheikh Mohammed, for example, who claims to have been the planner of 9/11. He's the one that's the most
mastermind,
infamous of
right.
the group. But it's a very small group. There's like 15 to 20 people compared to the hundreds of others. And the high value people, maybe there's something to talk about as far as guilt and a reason to confine them. But the vast majority of these other people are still, after all, 174 left as we speak now. And most of those people, including my client, have never been charged with anything. They're just there, and without.
They're like POWs, except that the law doesn't think of them as POWs.
That's true. They're not treated like POWs, and with the POW, I guess when the war ends, that POWs are supposed to be set free. If we talk about the war being Afghanistan, I mean the original Afghanistan sort of came and went. The Taliban were sort of driven out, and it wasn't much of a war until we've come to the recent 2 or 3 years. But that aside, I just think it's important to point out that the vast majority of people being confined in Guantanamo have never been charged with anything. They're not considered high value. But with many of them, like my client, who was originally from Libya, if he was released, there is really no place for him to go at this stage because he cannot go back to Libya. He was visited early in his stay by a delegation from Libya. He and perhaps the other 12 Libyans, one by one, and they were each to a man informed that the government could hardly wait to get their hands on them, and if so,
The Libyan government.
the Libyan government, and if so, they would be tortured for a year and then at the end of the year, they would their wish to be executed would be granted. So
These
That's
people
it.
are not good tourist agents. That's not a real good sales talk.
But anyway, you know, you do feel that it's important that these people receive justice, and so far we have not accomplished that.
Well, but you've accomplished a great deal. I mean, we can all agree as lawyers that getting justice does not necessarily mean getting a positive outcome, right? I mean, that's what due process is about. But you sound skeptical even on the process.
Well, the process to be a meaningful process would be to confine people who have been charged and convicted of some kind of crime. And the vast majority of these people have not.
Now, we had a couple of votes on the Supreme Court, I forget which case it was, for the proposition that you should either try people or release them. Those were the two positions.
Mm-hmm. But one of the problems is where to try them.
Let's talk about that. Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you both on behalf of the management for this conversation and taking the time. And let me wish you and yours a wonderful holiday season. And I hope you both stay with it and keep on these issues. They're of interest to our country, and they're of interest to people here in Honolulu.
Thank you. I couldn't help noticing your last name is Fidell. Are you related to Jay Fidell by any chance?
Only by parentage.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Happy New Year to you.
Same to you.
What you've heard today is a long view on the issues raised by the Guantanamo detentions and the military commissions. Because the country has faced these issues for so many years, and because the trajectory of future events is so unpredictable, a public fatigue has set in. That's why this panel is so important and why we need to continue to cover these issues going forward.
Certainly an enlightening discussion, but that was only the half of it. In fact, the panel went on for an hour. To see the rest of this important and timely discussion, you can go to our website at thinktechhawaii.com, where we've posted the second half of the video. I'm sure you'll find it worthwhile. Bill Spencer, president of the Hawaii Venture Capital Association, is back, ready to give us this week's Spensation.
Peter Thiel, who was the co-founder of PayPal and is a multi-billionaire, made famous by the movie Facebook that just came out recently, Social Network. And what intrigued me was that he brought together a group of Silicon Valley luminaries, .com kings, investors, top-tier venture fund people, and he threw out a challenge, which I found to be quite interesting. He really asked them the question, why don't we start funding futuristic ideas that have bold potential, rather than just chasing after the next mobile app or group coupon? And really put it to him with a bunch of ideas related to human health, establishing ocean-based cities, ideas that for the most part would be considered too futuristic and far-fetched for safe investing. But these are guys that have lots of money. These are guys that could make that kind of move. He called it breakthrough philanthropy, which I really thought was an interesting idea. But the idea is to basically put money behind bold ideas that could improve everyone's lot instead of just taking it safe and playing it safe. And so I started thinking, well, this is really where Hawaii is at a real tipping point. With the new administration and the economy the way it is, we can't afford to keep playing it safe. We have to make some bold moves. We can't put all our eggs in that basket, but clearly it's time to think with a bigger vision. Think about some breakthroughs that we could make and support those companies that are actually thinking futuristically.
I guess what you're saying is we have to move into a space that nobody's really thought about before.
Yeah, and I think we have to acknowledge that science and technology continues to accelerate at a rapid rate. We have to take advantage of that acceleration potential. We've laid the groundwork. We have great biotech companies like Tissue Genesis that have breakthrough technology, but they need funding and support. We have companies that want to do fish farms in the open ocean, but those companies need our support. Hawaii has some strategic advantages that can bring things to bear that can't be done anywhere else in the world, especially in energy. We need to support those visionary entrepreneurs, and I think this idea that Peter Thiel has of breakthrough philanthropy is a good start, because all of our big institutions constantly play it safe. They're afraid to really look into the future and dip their toe in the water. So it's time to change the attitude. And I hope our new administration can stimulate that kind of thinking. Now's the time.
Now's the time, Bill. Looking forward to 2011 coming soon.
Absolutely.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
We'll be right back to wrap up this week's edition of ThinkTech, but first we want to thank our underwriters.
Thanks to the Scheidler Family Foundation. Jay Scheidler, through the Scheidler Family Foundation, is an active supporter of a number of educational, cultural, and charitable organizations, including ThinkTech Hawaii.
Hawaiian Electric Company, HECO and its affiliates Miko on Maui and Helco on the Big Island are deeply committed to supporting the communities they serve.
Galen Ho. Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company, which has a large presence in and commitment to Hawaii.
The High Tech Development Corporation, HTDC, is a state agency dedicated to developing Hawaii's high-tech industry, diversifying our economy, and providing quality jobs for our people.
Okay, Duke. That wraps up this week's edition of ThinkTech. Remember, you can watch ThinkTech on OC16 several times every week. For additional times, check out oc16.tv.
For lots more ThinkTech videos, and for underwriting and sponsorship opportunities on ThinkTech on OC16, visit thinktechhawaii.com. Be a sponsor and help us reach Hawaii.
I'm Jay Fidell. Thanks for joining us on ThinkTech.
And I'm Duke Oshi. Aloha, everyone.